A University of China weighed in. They compared commonly eaten insects like crickets and grasshoppers to a juicy sirloin steak. The researchers measured the amount of iron in each food source. They then calculated how much could be absorbed by the human digestive system. Who won the food competition? Crickets! They provide more iron than both the other insects and the steak. Turns out bugs are even healthier than we thought. Well, Jiminy Cricket, tonight on the menu, bug bites. Maybe the local flea market delivers.
The Lowdown on Science is produced by LDOS Media Lab in partnership with the University of California Irvine Science Communication and 89.3 KPCC, and made possible with the generous support of the Fuse Family Foundation. On the web at LOHDOWNonscience.org.
WLRI LP Gap Lancaster.
This is Global Community Radio, Channel 1, News and More. Portions rebroadcast on KFZR-LP, Fraser Park, KIEZ-LP, Monroe, KLQS-LP, Agua Dulce, KPDO, Pescadero, WLRI-LP, Gap, WMUU-LP, Madison, WRAQ-LP, Angelica, WXDR-LP, New Orleans, and WXIR-LP, Rochester.
Hello and welcome to Background Briefing, available 24/7 at backgroundbriefing.org. I'm Ian Masters, and today we'll examine a number of stories and issues in the news. We'll begin with an analysis of whether we are now entering not just a post-American but a post-Western era with China as Trump inflames xenophobia and Xi Jinping stokes Chinese nationalism. Ambassador Chaz Freeman, a senior fellow at Brown University's Watson Institute for International and Public Affairs, who was the former director of Chinese affairs at the U.S. State Department and the principal interpreter during the late President Nixon's groundbreaking visit to China in 1972, joins us. With Putin and Xi Jinping appearing to get along like new best friends at the economic summit in St. Petersburg, we will assess whether the opening Nixon made with China, which put the U.S. in the catbird seat, playing the USSR off against the PRC, has now been reversed. And we will discuss the recent talk Ambassador Freeman gave at the Freeman-Spogli Institute for International Relations at Stanford on hostile coexistence with China, and look into whether Trump's erratic hostility to China in pursuing a trade war to get them to cry uncle will work. The Chinese apparently believe this is an integrated U.S. strategy, which it is not, because Trump is all about government by stunt to sow chaos, then fix a problem he has created to make himself look like a hero to get re-elected in 2020 in order to stay out of jail. Then we'll speak with Raul Hinojosa Ojeda, who is the founder and director of the North American Integration and Development Center at UCLA, and one of the people who originally proposed the North American Development Bank, which Mexico's President López Obrador is using as a vehicle to enact his part of the bargain he struck with Trump months ago, in spite of Trump's sudden reversal of his tariffs threat over the weekend, claiming victory in solving a crisis Trump created. Raul attended the Defense of National Dignity rally in Tijuana that López Obrador held on Saturday, and we'll examine whether the Trump administration will follow the Mexican president's advice to address the immigration problem at its root in Central America by making life more livable for the people in the countries from which asylum seekers are fleeing. Then finally, we'll examine further the border issues which Trump appears to be deliberately exacerbating to rally his base. At the same time, address the real and growing humanitarian problem that the U.S. has not been able to solve, which Trump is trying to make the much less resourced and capable country of Mexico responsible for. Guadalupe Correa Cabrera, a professor of public policy and government at George Mason University and the president of the Association of Borderland Studies at the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars, joins us. The author of Los Zetas, Inc., Criminal Corporations, Energy, and Civil War in Mexico. She will try to separate manufactured problems from real ones. And joining us now is Ambassador Chaz Freeman, a senior fellow at Brown University's Watson Institute for International and Public Affairs. He was Assistant Secretary of Defense for International Security Affairs from 1993 to 1994, earning the highest public service award of the Department of Defense for his roles in designing a NATO-centered post-Cold War European security system and in establishing defense and military relations with China. He also served as U.S. ambassador to Saudi Arabia and as deputy chief of mission and chargé d'affaires in the American embassies in both Bangkok and Beijing. The former director for Chinese affairs at the U.S. Department of State, he was the principal American interpreter during the late President Nixon's path-breaking visit to China in 1972, and he recently gave a talk at the Freeman Spogli Institute for International Studies entitled On Hostile Coexistence with China. Welcome to Background Briefing, Ambassador Chas Freeman.
Glad to be with you.
Well, thank you, Ambassador. And today's New York Times has a lead article suggesting that the whole border crisis with Mexico over Trump's threat to impose tariffs to punish Mexico for not stopping the flow of immigrants. It turns out apparently the deal was struck months ago, and that this is sort of government by stunt, a reality TV way of ginning up a phony crisis and then solving it to make yourself look like a hero and help get reelected. Is that mechanism also at play with China?
I think it is, actually. I think the article you're referring to, or perhaps it's another one in the New York Times today, a very good article by
Peter Baker,
Columbia University, Vertime, Columbia University historian, makes a very valid point that the current crisis in U.S.-China relations has more to do with American anxieties than with anything the Chinese have done. It seems to me, in part, a manipulation of public opinion for purposes of electoral standing. Unfortunately, Mr. Trump doesn't preside over any sort of unified view among his subordinates, and so we have multiple incompatible agendas at work in the trade talks, which is one of the main reasons they've not just failed, but metastasized and basically contaminated every other element of our relationship.
Well, we, of course, under Trump have the American First proposal, plan, agenda, whatever you want to call it. But so it's a little bit disingenuous to be upset that the Chinese are, putting themselves first. But you mentioned in your article, let me just quote this: "Meantime, the ineptitude of the American elite revealed in the 2008 financial crisis, the regular eruptions of racial violence and gun massacres in the United States, the persistence of paralyzing political constipation in Washington, and the arrogant unilateralism of America First have greatly diminished the appeal of America to the Chinese elite." How about the Chinese people in general, albeit that they live in a police state under censorship? Is there a detectable change in their attitude? I understand they're no longer buying iPhones for patriotic reasons. They're buying the cheaper Chinese version.
Actually, some of the Chinese phones are at least as good or maybe better than iPhones, which is part of our problem. That is, we are facing competition with a country that is enormously competent in some respects, and which has 8 times as many scientific, technological, engineering, and mathematics workers as we do, and which is producing more at 3 times the rate we are. So I think the attitude of the Chinese toward us really did begin to change in 2008 with the financial crash engineered by the wizards of Washington. And some Chinese, quite wrongly, I think, came to the conclusion that there wasn't much more to be learned from the United States or from the West in general. A touch of hubris and arrogance, which had not been present, began to infect their attitude toward the world. Mr. Trump's erratic behavior and the deluge of vituperative comment out of the political elite in Washington, not, by the way, in the states, but in the federal capital, have thoroughly turned off Chinese on the United States. And the most recent development was a caution by the Chinese government to parents and potential students in American universities to think twice about coming here for a whole series of reasons, including racism and discrimination and abuse by the security agencies like the FBI. So the relationship is clearly on a psychological level in a rapid stage of deterioration on both sides.
And again, I'm speaking with Ambassador Chas Freeman, who's a senior fellow at the Brown University's Watson Institute for International and Public Affairs. He was the former director of Chinese Affairs at the United States Department of State and was the principal American interpreter during the late President Nixon's path-breaking visit to China in 1972, and he recently gave a talk at the Freeman Spogli Institute for International Studies entitled On Hostile Coexistence with China. So given that China still is a defender of free trade and the Trump administration is all about mercantilism, if not crony capitalism and self-dealing, what do you mean by we are now entering not just a post-American but a post-Western era with China?
Well, the rules of the international order derive from the era of European imperialism and colonialism, followed by American ascendancy, which reinforced those rules and somewhat changed them. I think, by and large, they're pretty good rules. The Chinese think so. They are, like everyone else abroad, distressed that the United States has decided apparently to abandon the order that it itself created and no longer apply the rules to itself, even as it sometimes continues to demand that others follow them. So the United States is pulled out of multilateral organizations. The Trump administration is trying very hard to hamstring and incapacitate the World Trade Organization, which has been the principal mechanism for orderly dispute settlement in economics internationally. We dropped out of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which was then rather ironically picked up by Japan, which was trying to organize its own economic sphere of influence again to counter China. And we are just not participating in more and more international rule setting, and we deviate from others in our interpretations of the rules and our willingness to implement them.
Well, it would seem that, in retrospect, that Trump, of course, pulled out of the TPP in, I think, about the first week, along with the Paris Accords, and then, of course...
Then the first day, actually.
It was the first day. So that, to my mind, was more of not so much a trade arrangement, but a geopolitical arrangement in order to get the neighborhood organized so that to force China to play by the rules. And it seems detectable that since TPP was withdrawn, Xi Jinping has been able to move more towards a cult of personality and stoking nationalism and materialism and China first, if you will. Is there a correlation there?
Well, I think that you're correct that TPP was more geopolitical than trade driven, and in fact, I thought it wasn't a very good arrangement at all. But on the other hand, it was the mechanism we chose to sustain our presence and credibility in Asia, the credibility of our continuing involvement, and we just threw it away. So we are now in a position where we're devoting our time and energy to defending American primacy in Asia, but we ourselves have undercut that primacy. I don't know that there's a connection to internal developments in China. I think the Chinese, in due course, would naturally become less passive and less inclined to avoid reacting to provocations from abroad. And they, from their perspective, they see a lot of provocations. The U.S. Navy is prowling just off their coast, very aggressively patrolling, transiting the Taiwan Strait, which is an international waterway, but doing so in a way that makes it clear that they're cocking a snoot at China. We are engaged, obviously, in trying to smash Chinese companies. We've connived in the arrest of Chinese corporate executives. We are trying to cut China off technology. We're trying to limit what Chinese students in the United States can study. And the whole thing, I wouldn't say it's a Cold War, but it's definitely a deep chill that is setting in. And I think that has some impact on China, but I think the Chinese are simply proceeding on their own course internally and politically rather than reacting much to us.
And do you see broader changes underway? As I mentioned in the opening, that you were there translating for Nixon and Mao in '72, and that initiative opening of Nixon's, of course, put the U.S. in the catbird seat, being able to play off the USSR against the PRC. Are there any indications to your mind from the kind of love fest between Xi Jinping and Putin on Friday in St. Petersburg at the Economic Summit? Do you think that arrangement that put America in the catbird seat has been reversed?
Well, I think we've done that to ourselves. I mean, we've been pushing hard against the Russians in Europe with the expansion of NATO and the proposed addition of Ukraine to NATO, which is something that definitely crosses the Russian red line when we knew about that. And we've been pushing on the Chinese from the other direction, and we pushed the two of them together. I don't think this is an alliance between Moscow and Beijing, but it is an entente, that is a limited cooperation for limited purposes, perhaps for a limited time, and both sides are approaching things very, very pragmatically, and they're finding a lot of things to cooperate on. Among the things they talked about in St. Petersburg was a joint project for heavy lift troop transporting helicopter. They're working on a wide-bodied jet to compete with Airbus and Boeing. They are looking at a whole series of military projects. Russia is involved in building multiple nuclear power stations in China. The two are more and more engaged in joint exercises of one sort or another in the military sphere. So they undoubtedly they have the best relationship those two countries have ever had, and this is a result of Chinese policy that goes back to the collapse of the Soviet Union. The Chinese very explicitly decided then that eventually Russia would come back, and when it did, they wanted it to be a friend, a partner, rather than hostile or an enemy. And they've succeeded with a great deal of help from us. I think the Russians were reluctant, but we left them with nowhere to turn but to the Chinese and a bit to the Turks.
Well, just in the last couple of minutes, Ambassador Freeman, turning to the real problems, which there are between the U.S. and China, particularly with property theft, which concerns American business. You've pointed out there is a cultural difference here that perhaps we don't understand, that in Chinese culture, copying somebody's work is a form of flattery. So explain that, if you will.
Well, if you look at the history of Chinese art, for example, or Chinese poetry, you'll find that successive generations revere and express their admiration for previous generations by copying elements of what they've done. And this is a very deeply ingrained tradition. But the modern world that has come to China is contrary to this, and the Chinese, I think, now very much understand the need for ownership of intellectual property, and they're actually becoming quite good at protecting it. The Chinese legal system is sometimes used now by Western companies who find it more efficient, less costly and quicker to resolve disputes, most of which, by the way, if there are disputes between foreigners and Chinese, the foreigners have had the better batting average in the Chinese courts. So I think there's a disconnect here. The people around the Trump administration dealing with China are not themselves people who've done business in China. Mr. Lighthizer, the U.S. Special Trade Representative, is a trade litigator who was involved in trying to curtail Japan's growth in the 80s and who hates multilateral institutions like the WTO. Mr. Mnuchin, the Treasury Secretary, is basically a mortgage banker, no experience dealing with trade as such. Mr. Ross, the Secretary of Commerce, is a scavenger of distressed assets, which he turns around and remarkets. And again, he's not been active in trade. Peter Navarro, the president's primary economic advisor on China, is widely regarded as a bit of a nut. And he rejects Adam Smith and Ricardo explicitly. So he's very, very definitely mercantilist and also extremely anti-Chinese. So, this isn't a complaint. The complaints have come from the business community, which have wanted the U.S. government to back them. But they never wanted a tariff war. They didn't want a trade war. They didn't want an effort to bring China down. If anything, they would favor an effort to build the United States up and make us more competitive, not try to level others, which I don't think will work in any event. We need to get our own act together, not try to damage China's.
Just in closing, does that come down to the elections in 2020?
If Mr. Trump is reelected, we're going to have more of this sort of rogue superpower behavior that is highly destructive of the world order. There will be more mercantilist, contradictory, and counterproductive moves in the trade area. He may retain a decent speaking relationship with Xi Jinping, but U.S.-China relations will continue their rapid decline. So I think there's no evidence to date that Mr. Trump learns anything from his mistakes. He doesn't even admit he makes mistakes. Everything is a magnificent success for him.
Well, Ambassador Chaz Freeman, I thank you very much for joining us here today.
My pleasure.
And again, I've been speaking with Ambassador Chaz Freeman, who's a senior fellow at Brown University's Watson Institute for International and Public Affairs. He was Assistant Secretary of Defense for International Security Affairs from 1993 to 1994, earning the highest public service awards of the Department of Defense for his roles in designing a NATO-centered post-Cold War European security system and in re-establishing defense and military relations with China. He also served as U.S. Ambassador to Saudi Arabia and as Deputy Chief of Mission and Chargé d'Affaires in American embassies in both Bangkok and Beijing, and he's the former director for Chinese affairs at the United States Department of State and was the principal American interpreter during the late President Nixon's path-breaking visit to China in 1972, and he recently gave a talk at the Freeman-Spogli Institute for International Studies entitled On Hostile Coexistence with China. We're going to take a brief station break, and we'll be back speaking with Raul Hinojosa Ojeda, who was in Tijuana on Saturday for the rally that called Defense of National Dignity held by Mexico's President López Obrador.
Tiempo va a pasar para que pueda mejorar. Todos somos víctimas Hay más de un estado confiscado con un gobierno involucrado en las ganancias del narco. Es una nación podrida con la población herida. México, 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 México.
Welcome back. I'm Ian Masters, and this is Background Briefing, available 24/7 at backgroundbriefing.org. And joining us now is Raul Hinojosa Ojeda, who is the founder and director of the North American Integration and Development Center at UCLA, where he researches the political economy of regional integration, focusing on Latin America. He was one of the people who originally proposed the North American Development Bank, which Mexico and the United States created in 1994. Welcome to Background Briefing, Raul Hinojosa Ojeda.
Great to be with you, Ian.
Well, thank you, Raul. You were in Tijuana on Saturday for the rally that López Obrador, Mexico's president, held. It was called Defense of National Dignity. The whole confrontation that preceded it turned out to be a reality TV stunt and a total fraud, in as much as the deal was struck apparently between Mexico and America back in December, but Trump ginned up this phony crisis threatening Mexico to rally his base, and I guess López Obrador was pretty clever not to take the bait, would you say?
Well, I think that they've been trying to walk a very fine line. On the one hand, they're really concerned with such a volatile and pyromanic president who loves to start fires and then pretend he's going to put them out. I think the interesting dynamic that's created by this news that most of these agreements had already been done way before this week's negotiations in Washington also allows the Mexican government to basically say, as the foreign minister Ebrard said, Mexico maintained its dignity intact in the negotiations, in the sense that it basically